That's a good question.
All right, can you hear
But
me
will you
now?
ask that question to me, please? Because I'll have a chance to explain it
I'd like to get going. Quiet, please.
when I have questions. Yeah.
Thank you. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Kassam. And Dr. Kassam is an international professor of environmental and indigenous studies in the Department of Natural Resources and the American Indian and Indigenous Studies program here at Cornell University. In 2018, Dr. Kassam, in collaboration with the Canadian Embassy in Kabul, senior advisors at the Presidential Palace and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, initiated the process which led the President of Afghanistan to create a position devoted specifically to address climate change adaptation for all government agencies. In 2017, he was awarded the University of Bayreuth in Germany International Seniors Fellowship for his contributions to the Faculty of Biology, Chemistry, and Earth Sciences. Dr. Kassam's objective is to seamlessly merge teaching with applied research in the service of communities. His research focuses on the complex connectivity of human and environmental relations, addressing indigenous ways of knowing, food sovereignty, sustainable livelihood, stewardship, and climate change. This research is conducted in partnership with indigenous communities such as the Standing Rock Sioux Nation here in the US, the St. Regis Mohawk Tribe, the US, as well as in the Pamir Mountains of Afghanistan, Tajikistan, the Kangor Shan Mountains of China, and the Alay Mountains of Kyrgyzstan. In 2016, he was awarded almost $1.5 million to lead a project to develop anticipatory capacity for climate change. By investigating the relationship between biological and cultural diversity, Dr. Kassam seeks to expand the foundations of the notion of pluralism. Let's welcome Dr.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me to participate in your seminar. I've been looking forward to this because I want to tell you a story. I want to tell you the story of our research. I'm sure there have been other colleagues who have come and told you exactly what the impacts of climate change are and provided models and so on. I would like to tell you a story of our current research looking specifically at building anticipatory capacity for climate change. So that's my plan for the next 60 minutes, 50 minutes. And since this is a class on climate change challenges and perspectives on that, let me begin with my own perspective. These are the regions of the world where I work, in high latitudes and high altitudes. My research on climate change was actually driven because of partnerships with indigenous communities in the Western Arctic. And because we engage in a partnership, they help set the research agenda. So I would like you to understand that I did not come to the issue of climate change because I wanted to. It was because we were engaged in a human ecology project, looking at the impact of chemical pollutants in the Arctic. And as we were doing that research, we were beginning to find in our research changes to sea ice, effects on the food system of the Inupiaq, the Inuvialuit, and the Chukchi in the Western Arctic. And we began to consider those because our community partners asked us to look at that. And this was in the mid to late 90s. And this brought me to climate change. I would like you to understand that I find it a very challenging and an emotionally draining experience. So in 2006, a foundation called me and said, we will give you funding to look at research that interests you. And since your shtick is biological and cultural diversity, we would like, and this work you have been doing in the Arctic and subarctic, we would like you to look at it in the context of the Pamir Mountains or the mountains of Central Asia. And of course, I was very excited because I thought, a break from climate change. And when I landed in 2006, as I went through the Pamir Mountains of Afghanistan, through the Pamir Mountains of the Tajik Republic, they weren't using the phrase climate change. They weren't using that phrase in the Arctic either, but they were describing to me exactly the dramatic impacts of climate change. And for me, the issue of climate change is about local impact at the level of the valley, at the level of the town, at the level of the village. And so that's what keeps me awake at night, because of my partnership agreement between communities and my research group. So that's the story I want to tell you. So given that this is a class on perspectives on climate change, here in the United States and some other parts of the world, there are still conflicting perceptions on climate change. And some of those conflicting perceptions are driven by values. And so that continues to be a challenge. And climate change, anthropogenic climate change, is an emergent phenomenon. It is new and it's changing. And it is characterized by dramatic uncertainty. And it defies easy formulations. We can't apply simple formulas and say, if we just plug everything in here, the model will work. Just a few months back, we found out that our models about the absorption capacity of the oceans with respect to climate change were dramatically wrong. So it's not easy. It cannot be characterized by simple formulations. Furthermore, it's difficult to comprehend what's happening in one area is not happening in another area. And we can see this 1,000 meters apart where I work. Just 1,000 meters difference. And therefore, it is highly contingent. It is context specific. And therefore, for me, as I stated earlier, building anticipatory capacity and reducing the level of anxiety at the level of the village, at the level of the town, at the level of the community is a priority. So that's the narrative I would like to talk about. I will begin by sharing with you my objectives for today's presentation. I will restate the issue and make some propositions that helped us think about this issue in a different way. I will describe the research context of our current work, which is underway and not complete. I will talk about our analytical approach, and specifically, I will be presenting to you something about ecological calendars. I sent out 3 readings, but I understand they're not a requirement. So if you're going to read one of it, look at the one that was published in 2018 that describes our work on ecological calendar. I would like to talk about our response to our research on ecological calendars, and then answer your questions. Professor Hess just told me I should be prepared to be here at least till 4:10 this afternoon. So I have 3 objectives. I want to share with you this narrative about developing anticipatory capacity at the local level. I want to elaborate on a transdisciplinary approach to co-generation of knowledge. And that approach, I think, might be slightly different than what other people talk about when they talk about transdisciplinary. And then I want to illustrate to you that adaptation strategies to anthropogenic climate change need to be grounded to the local culture and the local ecology. And we can't think about it by separating those two. Both have to be taken into account because they are integrated, and whatever strategy we come up with has to be rooted in the context. So that's my plan. Based on the earlier map that I showed you, I began doing research 32 years ago, when I was 20 years old. And over the time of this research to present, I have watched and worked with indigenous communities and rural communities, both in mountainous areas, in the northern forest, and in coastal areas. And these communities are at the vanguard. They are at the forefront of climatic variation. But they didn't contribute to it. They largely didn't contribute to it. They're having the effects of other people's actions. And it is directly impacting their food systems and their livelihoods, whether we're talking about the Arctic or the Pamir Mountains of Central Asia. And this is causing anxiety. Now, I'd like you to understand that these communities that I'm describing in the Arctic, whether they are hunting and gathering communities, or whether they are farmer or herder communities in the mountainous areas, these communities look forward to seasonal change. They don't have a problem with change. In fact, our entire food system depends on change and variation in weather. So that's not the issue. The issue is the intensity, the frequency of unusual climate events, and the anxiety caused by the inability to predict. That's the issue. And believe it or not, 70 to 80% of the global food system still depends on the small landholder and the small herder. 70 to 80%. And evidence indicates that 90% of the micronutrients that we need in our bodies come from those farms and not the large mechanized ones. So this is not just an issue of their needs, it's an issue of our needs. Because Dushanbe, Nairobi, other towns and cities in the lowlands depend on these small landholders. And the other thing is that climatic variation is not arriving when life was hunky-dory. It's arriving on existing inequities, whether we're talking about structural poverty, the continuous destabilization of women in certain societies, or whether we're talking about health. It is coming on existing inequities, and it's exacerbating them. So this is not just an intellectual issue. It's an issue about justice and about just action. And therefore, I'm addressing specifically the undergraduate and graduate students in the room. And therefore, for scholars, it warrants our attention. Because you're sitting in the part of Cornell that is land-grant and that is funded by the taxpayer. So there is an imperative here for just action. So this is the issue for me. Now some propositions, some what ifs. What if we visualized, conceived of, and thought about time as experience, as a unique experience? What if we thought about time as experience rather than as an arrow of progression? And what if within that unique experience, within that short period of experience, whatever it is, we thought that time is flexible and relational? So when I say, what if time is a unique experience? Let me give you an example. Think about, for the older members in the room, think about the half an hour that you went for a root canal. Is it the same half an hour as the moments that you were waiting for the birth of your first child? Are those half an hours exactly the same? Are they tradable? Or are they actually very different experiences, even though they're only 30 minutes? Or for the younger members of the class, the root canal works. Or the first moment you had with an intimate moment with your friend. Is that half an hour, that first few moments, the same as the root canal? Or is it a different experience altogether? What if we conceptualize time in that way? And within that conceptualization, what if we saw it as something flexible and something that was complexly connected in relationships to other things? So that's the proposition I'm trying to make. And if time is indeed experienced, then this conception of time might help us unwrap anticipating climate change at the level of the village, at the level of the town, or at the level of the valley. So now the research context. I said to you, I wasn't looking to do climate change research. So in 2006, as I flew directly from the Arctic to Central Asia, and I knew nothing about Central Asia at that time. I stopped in Istanbul, and my undergraduate students had piled documents so that I could learn about the cultures, about the geography, about the Soviet system, and so on, and its impact on the area just before I landed. And so this is the research context where I, again, saw the issue of climate change much like the Arctic. I'd like to emphasize that it is a strategic region of the world. So it is a region where the borders of the Cold War were, and that have been remade as the clash of civilization, these borders. It is an area that is pregnant with renewable and non-renewable resources. It is an area where there is dramatic biological and cultural diversity. And in this area, there are agricultural societies as well as pastoral societies, and all kinds of variations between that, from orcharding to hunting and so on. So there are different ecological professions. And these ecological professions vary across multiple ethnicities, multiple linguistic groups, and so on. And so when I arrived in 2006, people were describing to me as I was going through the communities, and you saw the map. So I either did it by walking or on horseback, were describing to me increased water levels in rivers and lakes due to greater rapid and snow melt and glacial melt. At lower elevations, loss because of that of valuable agricultural land. At higher elevations, increasing glacial fed lakes, which then you can imagine in an area where there is seismic activity as these mountains, what would happen if there was an earthquake? And communities would be wiped out, and villages would be wiped out, as they have been over the past 12 years that I've been doing research in this area. Increased intensity of rainfall in the spring, more frequent avalanches and rock slides. By the way, with the pictures, if there is no caption, they're mine. If there's a caption, it's somebody else who did it. It's very important to give credit where credit is due. Anyway, the reason why I talk about pictures is I want you to note this particular picture, because the Canadian general, after seeing it, asked for that picture. And maybe at the end you can ask me why this picture is important. Plowing and sowing begins about 15 to 20 days earlier or 30 days earlier. And I'd like you to imagine the implications of that. How many communities around the world have festivals associated with the vernal equinox, spring, with harvest festivals? I grew up in Alberta, and specifically near the Rocky Mountains. And it would be hard for you to imagine with a name like Karim, but Christmas holidays are very important to me. Even though I know he was born in July, because that's when the supernova was, the Star of Bethlehem. I know that he didn't have blonde hair and blue eyes. He probably looked more like me, and didn't speak Hebrew, he spoke Aramaic. But yet, when it's Christmas time, I'm always looking forward to the snow. And then when there is snow, I know it's Christmas, even though it doesn't match the facts. Now, why am I giving you such a trite example? I want you to understand that even as trite as that may seem, in communities where their livelihoods are fundamentally linked to their habitat, and their success means our food system, then imagine when there is variation between the key festivals of the vernal equinox, spring, the time to plant and sow, and when these cultural festivals are out of sync with the reality that they're facing. Imagine the anxiety that would cause and the implications of that. And I'm using my example of snow at Christmas time as a trite way of conveying that. Change in the quality of certain fruits because of vernalization. I'm not a biological scientist or a physical scientist. I'm actually a humanities and social science prof. So it was my colleagues that explained to me that certain fruits need cold days, not just warm days, such as apples, pears, and so on. And these impacts varied depending on context. And therefore, were creating tremendous anxiety. And when they were talking about these impacts to me in 2006, they described a calendar that they had. They said we used to use a calendar of the human body, an ecological calendar. And we would measure time, and we had it exact when we followed that calendar. And so I started asking them more about that calendar. And in 2007, when I went back, we looked for information. 2008, when we went back, and so on. And we kept on going back, trying to get more information. What we found is because of Soviet colonization, because of an over 40 years of war in Afghanistan, that knowledge had been suppressed. And so they had lost parts of that knowledge. So we started to look for evidence to build on that knowledge. But before I describe those calendars, let me share with you my perspective. So imagine people of the Pamirs or the Arctic. They have relations that are direct and indirect with people, let's say, in Northern Europe that lived 150 years ago, let's say in England. And the behavior of those industrialized countries in Northern Europe affected glaciers and sea ice over time, which then is affecting other non-human life, which is affecting the people of the Pamirs or the Arctic. So at a global level, this level of complex connectivity of relationships, or even within a region, That's the human ecological perspective that I am applying. So now back to the analytical approach. So when we heard about these calendars, in 2009, we started collecting information. We started doing research. So we went and looked at Russian ethnographic information from the 1900s to about the 1950s. And we started collecting manuscripts of Russian ethnographers. We even found a 500-year-old Persian manuscript describing these calendars. So here is a climate change problem where we're using ethnography. We need to have knowledge of Russian. We need to have knowledge of Persian. And we also looked at German ethnographics. So we needed to have knowledge of German so that we could access everything we needed to know about ecological calendars. And what are we doing? We're studying climate change. So I want you to understand the level of disciplines we had to draw to be able to engage this issue in the context of the Palm years. So the red, the yellow, and the orange dots are the ethnographic data, archival ethnographic data in different villages. The green is our own interviews and our own ethnographic research. So what we found, we moved and found evidence further to the northeast in the Pamir Mountains and further to the south and southeast in the Pamir Mountains, evidence of ecological calendars. In fact, we found 17 different calendars, which they call calendars of the human body, and not a single one matched. They were never the same. And initially, the earlier male Russian ethnographers concluded that the men are senile, their informants were senile, they were too old, and that's why the calendars didn't match. But there was one brilliant female Russian ethnographer, and she thought about it in a different way. She thought about the ecological zones where those calendars were. And so the ecological calendar for Upper Kuf, which is only 1,000 meters away from Lower Kuf, are completely different. Because Lower Kuf grew apples, pears, plums, wheat, barley, and Upper Kuf can only grow barley because of elevation and ecological zone. So necessarily, the calendars will be different. So what we found was that these calendars were context specific. They were geared for that region. And furthermore, we found that these calendars existed across ethnicities. So the Bartangi, the Darwazi, the Rushani, the Shugni, the Waki, and so on, the Vanji, all had these calendars. It went across different ethnicities. And now, as our work continues, we have found even those with Altaic speaking languages, completely different language family, not just a different ethnicity, but completely different language family, also have these calendars as we stretch across Xinjiang, China, as we stretch across Kyrgyzstan and so on. So we found tremendous diversity of ethnicity, ecological zone, as well as ecological professions. So the calendars were designed for hunters, for herders, and so on. So what are these calendars? Well, as I said, time is unique. So the arrival of a migratory bird, the nascence of a flower, the appearance of an insect, the nature of the snow cover, the soundscape and breakup of ice, the soundscape of birds, not seeing them but hearing them, all marked certain cues and chains of livelihood activities. So these biophysical indicators were the way by which to tell time vis-a-vis one's livelihood activities and food systems. And in this particular region, this is an idealized calendar. Like I said, they're all different. They would measure time on their body, and they would start from the toenail and go all the way up to the head and then back down again. And during the question and answers, you can ask me about these moments where they suspended measuring time altogether. They said, okay, now we don't need to measure time. And they did something with that during that period. But anyway, generally around the heart were the autumnal and vernal equinoxes. So as the sun moved up, and then as the sun moved down, the equinox was around the heart. And time was measured according to certain signs, and you'd say, okay, now the sun is in the knee, now the sun is in the groin, and so on. So we started putting these calendars together. And we found, as I said, tremendous diversity amongst them, and that they were very context specific, and that's why they were diverse, and that they were complexly connected to the habitat, both with respect to the culture, as well as what was happening. So for example, and here I'm giving you the example, I'm jumping a little ahead, of Lake Oneida. When a particular flower emerges through the snow, the martins are running and starting to mate. The fish are biting, and it is time to sow. So there are a whole chain of activities that are cued in together that reveal and suggest to the person what action to take. So this fit our human ecological perspective because people are defined by both their culture and their habitat within a specific region. And that their calendars required very keen observation of their ecological niche. The photograph on the right is a rock which marks the vernal equinox when the sun comes through at a certain point. They know it's time. And this local topography, whether it's mountain peaks, the biodiversity, were the key markers of time throughout this. Now, what was interesting to us was that the calendar of the human body was performative. So I know feminist scholars talk about embodied knowledge. Well, here is embodied knowledge that has been changing over thousands of years. Because imagine if we found that Persian manuscript that told us they've been using these ecological calendars for 1,000 years, you can bet there was climatic variation over 1,000 years, which means they adapted and altered their calendar. So that means they have agency, which is another important perspective, viewing human beings not as victims, but as agents when discussing the issue of climate change. And this is very important, just as those propositions at the beginning when I was talking about conceiving of time, it's also how we conceive of them within their habitat. So the calendar of the human body does not, or the ecological calendar does not determine time, but gives time meaning. So when we're looking at the human beings within that context, they are not off that region, but they are within that region. So the separation between nature and culture is facile to this way of thinking. because the two are embedded in each other. So that separation is facile to our, antithetical to our way of thinking when we're trying to develop anticipatory capacity. And that's why I began with saying one of my objectives is to demonstrate that whatever adaptation strategy we come up with, it has to be grounded in the culture and in the ecology of the area. So we found that these calendars were specific to altitude, aspect, valley, ecological zone, and cultural niche. And because of their lengthy use, they were very integrated, what I called complex connectivity, and refined. Now I want to make the second point about time as flexible and relational. So imagine I'm not unconscious of the fact that I'm in plant sciences giving this lecture. So imagine a flower appears on May 1st. And they call Cornell Cooperative Extension. And Cornell Cooperative Extension says, yes, it's time for you to plant. So they seed. And on September 1st, they reap a wonderful harvest. Now, what if there's early rainfall that year? And they call Cornell Cooperative Extension, and the extension agent says, well, look, the rules say May 1st. So they wait, even though the flower has already appeared, to seed on May 1st. And the harvest is not that great. Or alternatively, which I think is true, genuinely true of Cornell Cooperative Extension, they're very sensitive to the ecology, and they say the opposite. They say, look, you see the indicator, go ahead and plant in April rather than May. And they reap a harvest. This is what I mean about relational and flexible conception of time. So we said to ourselves, what if we looked at anticipatory capacity in that way? So I know I'm being recorded, so I'll be very careful, because we are in the United States, a litigious society. But between the late 1990s and since 2006, you can bet I called NASA and asked them for help for data, because they had the best models on the planet. And you can bet I made trips to the Earth Observatory at Columbia, which is actually based in New Jersey, higher elevation, and said, please, just one graduate student of yours for 1 year to help us out. We don't even need the profs. Just give us your graduate students to work with us. Anyway, that went on and on and on. And they were kind and polite, but I didn't get anywhere. But in 2014, so 1990s, late 1990s, 2006 in the Palm years, finally in 2014, the American Geophysical, this is the narrative part. I want the graduate students and the undergraduates to listen. This is how really research happens. It's not pure and set up in a system and you just tick things off. There are all kinds of constraints that you're facing, especially when you're trying to deal with a complex problem that is contingent. So in 2014, the American Geophysical Union called. And they said, we've heard about you from our friends in the ESA, the Ecological Society. And they said you've been asking for help. we'd love to help you out because we'd love to work with communities too. We'd like to engage them more. I said, great, I'm sending you a list of the things I need and the kinds of expertise I need to engage. And I sent it to them, and they took a week and wrote back, and they said, we're not sure how to help. How about we go to MIT? Let's all go to MIT and talk to them. So we said, okay, let's go to MIT. And you know how these folks are at MIT. They like crowdsourcing things. I never knew what crowdsourcing means. Basically, it means going on the web, outlining your problem, and then asking a whole bunch of graduate students and scientists and undergraduates to respond to the challenge. So we put up this challenge, and people started writing in all kinds of responses of how they would solve these problems that I was describing. And then that led to going to the Atkinson Center. They're nice folks, mostly run by biophysical scientists. Nice folks. They're just here, not far away. And we said to them, look, you know, if you could just give us a little bit of money, this is a transdisciplinary problem. It requires ornithologists, it requires linguists, it requires ethnographers, it requires climate scientists. Just give us a little bit of money and we will show you we can do this. And part of their requirement is that if they give us a little bit of money, we have to promise that we will do the work, no problem, but that we will put in for $1 million grant afterwards because they gave us a little bit of money. And I said, those are odds we can accept. They upped the rules for us a little bit because it was a social scientist and a humanities prof requesting $96,000. So they made us go through every hoop they could imagine. But they helped us and they gave us the funding we needed. That led to the funding from NSF, from the geoscience unit, which Professor Hess just referred to, the 1.45 million or 1.2 million euros. And what we did is we first built a team of interdisciplinary scientists here, and then we built it across nations with Germany, China, and Italy. So we built a team of scientists and said, we need all these different aspects to address the problem of anticipatory capacity at the local level. In order to give us 1.2 million, they said, you need to have a logo. We said, no problem. We will create a logo. So I sat down with a with a Navajo artist who was an undergraduate student here. And I said, can you help me make a logo? And I would draw on the whiteboard and she would make the designs. And we used the 3 primary colors to make yet another color that conveyed the food system and ecological indicators and biophysical indicators. So that's how we went about doing it. In 2006, we began. So when I am talking about transdisciplinary, I'm not talking about the anthropologist, the climatologist, the ethnographer, the botanist, the ecologist, the educationist, and so on, working together. They are supposed to be working together. Give me a break. We're funded by taxpayers. That's what NSF is. They're supposed to be working together. It becomes transdisciplinary when they start acknowledging and valorizing the knowledge of farmers, gatherers, herders, fishers, hunters, teachers, and so on. That's when it's truly transdisciplinary, because you need multiple ways of knowing. Because unfortunately, with wicked problems like climate change, expertise of one person or one field is not sufficient. as I just pointed out, we needed linguists to help us go through archival data. So this is what we submitted for the one. This is, I think this is worth 1.2 million euros. We said, look, we will establish partnerships with communities. We will jointly develop an interview protocol. We will train community researchers, and in return, the community researchers will train us in their culture. Meanwhile, our colleagues that are soil scientists and climate scientists will be compiling satellite data, remote sense data, collecting data from other sources, using their models and giving us a sense of what's happening in that level. Then we will bring it all together and we will ground truth it. So we will take the satellite data, we will take the remote sense data and bring it down from its coarse level so that we can test it at the level of the village. And in places where there is no data, we will put up climate stations. We will put in soil sensors so that we can get the data that we need. And then we will integrate that. So we started integrating here. This is the green. We started integrating all of that here. And we're around here right now. And then we said, okay, after we're done, we will, of course, try to implement these ecological calendars in all the communities where we're working. We will develop a knowledge sharing mechanism. We will, of course, publish peer-reviewed articles, and we will develop curriculum. This is what we promised. So we began. And this is in the town of Sarimugul in the Kyrgyz Republic. This young man with the cool sunglasses and the ball cap is one of our graduate students who worked with us for 3 field seasons, who is ethnic Kyrgyz from a small town where we're working, and now is a graduate student here doing research with us. This is what we mean by transdisciplinarity. Taking young people from the communities where we're working so that they join us in the work. My German colleague, who is very macho and only needed a t-shirt, my Italian colleague, myself, and others. This is in the Kyrgyz Republic in the Alai Valley. We built similar stations in the mountains where the pastures are. And as we built that, the communities would look after these stations for us. They would keep diaries so that we could get a record of things. They would take photographs on a regular basis. That's the nature of the partnership. So they're not just free labor, they're contributing insight to the system as we're going back and forth. And I'll share examples of that. I just want to point this picture out. Where do you think the young lady is from? Because there are so many misconceptions of the places where I work. Where do you think this young lady is from? The one that I just pointed out. Yes, you. She has a kind of a football jacket there. Where do you think she's from? She's just graduated as an undergraduate. Where do you think she's from? A wild guess. America, okay. Because she's blonde, right? Okay. She's indigenous to the Kungurshan Mountains. This is also China. It's the part of China we don't hear about. Or if we do hear about it, it's suppressed. There's tremendous diversity there. So it's politically very challenging, the places where we're working. So she's helping me meet with herders at a sacred site. And the very fact that we were meeting at a sacred site put them in danger. Because under communist China, you're not supposed to have these kinds of thoughts of sacred sites. Thoughts let alone action. And so these are the regions, 4 countries in the Pamir Mountains, Standing Rock Sioux Nation, which you know about because of the pipeline issue, and Lake Oneida. Lake Oneida is our only non-Indigenous community that we're working in. It is the nice people that voted for Mr. Trump. I think demonizing people is facile. It is our responsibility to ask them, what are their legitimate concerns? And you can bet that when we started our work in 2016, they were not thinking about climate change the way we were thinking, but they were facing dramatic impacts. So we worked in Standing Rock Sioux Nation in North and South Dakota, 10 communities there, around the Lake Oneida watershed, in the Alai Valley, the Bartang Valley in the Tajikistan, the Alai Valley in the Kyrgyz Republic, Tashkurgan in Xinjiang, China, and Shugna in Afghanistan. This region has now been overrun by the Taliban, so we have had to go to another direction and work with other villages. We began by inviting people over to a meal in their community. We would host the meal, including at Lake Oneida. And we would discuss the project. And once they agreed after the meal that they wanted to continue, then we would start the work. And we would start by asking a simple question. How do you know winter has ended? And as we did that, we developed rich ecological knowledge. And they laid out, this, by the way, is Lake Oneida. And they explained to us indicators that they used across the seasons. And we did that everywhere. And so we would use these seasonal rounds to determine key phenological indicators or biophysical indicators. Then we would look and test if these are viable. And we are in this process here of developing these calendars. So right now, we are in the process of validating. We just completed it. So we went through all the 4 communities in Central Asia, going back and validating with them. We said, is this the information you gave us last year? Here is the results of the interviews. Is this correct? Have we got it right? And they would discuss, disagree, and we would then alter our information and update it. But we didn't stop there. We asked our climate scientists, the young PhD students, to bring their data as well. And we put their data up. And they ground truthed it. So they would say, well, based on regional models and so on, this is the rainfall, this is the temperature. Is this your experience? It's very important that biophysical scientists get that ethnographic experience. And you know what? They're not frightened by it. They embrace it. But we need to work in a transdisciplinary manner, which demands respect and trust. So we have completed this in all the Pamir communities, in February at Lake Oneida, in November at Standing Rock, and that's the stage we're at right now. That's the point at the point we are at the story. Our objective is to create a transfer of knowledge between communities. Because remember, in mountain communities or elsewhere, there are different ecological zones. And these patterns are changing. And so sharing knowledge between communities is key. we're hoping in fall 2020 to host a conference right here at Cornell as we bring all these communities together. The scientists together, scientists from other parts of the world who are also doing research on ecological calendars, but not with us. And we're asking ourselves one more step. We're going one more step. We're saying, can we aesthetically and artistically represent our research? Can we exhibit it? Not just in a conference where we're sharing information, but is there another aesthetic way of conveying it? And as Professor Hess mentioned in the introduction, we've been directly working with the governments in the areas where we are to actually change policy. And in Afghanistan, we were very successful this summer, partly because Afghanistan has huge climate refugees. And they recognize that it's a greater threat than the war. In Washington, in December, we held a conference, a workshop on science diplomacy at the AGU, where people from NASA, the IUCN, State Department attended, as we talked about the role of science in creating this space. And then, of course, like any academic institutions, and one other thing. We have promised that we will come out with a curriculum that we will infuse into the education systems where we're working, so that we are never caught in a situation where kids have lost a link with their habitat. They, through their education system, are constantly updating those ecological calendars. So that's the plan, and of course, peer-reviewed articles. I know I've gone a little over than I had planned. But this is a photograph of me returning. I'm on the Afghan side, and this is China. Here is China. This is Afghanistan. And here, just a little to the edge here, are landmines. And I'm going to cross over into Tajikistan, where my vehicle is waiting for me. Why am I showing you this picture? It's the point I want to make about transdisciplinarity. Often my colleagues, when I began my research, and still till today, I have to justify myself sometimes to the administration because of where I work. I'm asked the question, well, what about the Taliban? Or what about this, or what about that? And I'll be honest with you, when we were doing this research, I wasn't thinking about the Taliban. They were not in my head. Perhaps that's irresponsible. I wanted to get to the source of the information, and I needed to meet these pastoralists on the Afghan side. And I was going to do anything possible to get there. Perhaps that's foolish, but I think that's how researchers and scholars think. But my response is this, having accepted perhaps some responsibility. How is it that the Kyrgyz trusted me with a horse and a young 12-year-old child to get back? Weren't they worried about this foreigner who would steal both their horse and their child? So research with communities and transdisciplinary research is about valorizing each other, respecting each other, and trusting in what other people know, because you know the limitations of your own field and your own expertise. Any questions? Yes.
Why is that picture? Let me get the microphone.
Okay. Oh, this one, sorry. Thank you. this young man in the orange shirt.
Why is that picture important? The one you told us to ask about? The one the Canadian general had asked for?
So look at the picture.
Okay.
Look at the picture carefully. You can see I'm not very good with technology. I could have sort of escaped and gotten to this. I'm in Afghanistan. I'm walking for 3 days. I unconsciously take this picture. I don't note it. I take it and I'm walking.
Mm-hmm.
What's happening here in this picture?
Looks like a lady is that paper, like a notebook maybe? Writing.
A girl is reading to a younger sibling.
Oh, okay.
While tending to the land. They're taking a little break and she's reading. That goes against every meta-narrative that we have of Afghanistan. The women are uneducated. They are in the Stone Ages. Right? You see what I mean? One can only understand if one goes to the context and engage it. Okay.
So you talked about gathering data in places that you didn't have data. I'm curious, what were the implications of doing that? Like you said, you needed to set up soil stations. Like where did the money come from to fund that? And like how hard was that? What's that?
The money came from our project. We had built that in. Our German colleagues bought the soil sensors. And whenever they couldn't make it to the field, they would teach us how to do it. And you saw we were collectively, like how many scientists does it take to build a little climate station, right? And you could imagine we had fun while doing all of that. So that's how we funded it. Sometimes we went and got it from other research projects nearby and promised that we would return it 3 or 4 years later. And so there was some goodwill by a lot of our German colleagues and a lot of goodwill from customs and border agents as we were bringing all this equipment in.
Thank you.
Yeah. With the idea of using the body as a calendar, for most of these communities, is that more of an internalization saying, okay, my knee is now this period, right, or is it more of a physical, they wear things, they mark parts of their body?
Yeah. So before I answer your question, understand about us in this room. We're biological beings. At least half of this room is permanently conscious of the cycles that they go through, approximately 29 days, right? And so we are fundamentally driven by cycles. When there is not enough sun, I'm affected. And I need to spend more time outside playing in the snow so that I feel good, right? So we are affected by these biological events. In the same way, these community members don't have this conception that they exist outside of nature. Yes, they use mobile phones. Yes, they have iPads. They know everything about GIS and so on, but they do not conceive of themselves outside the system. So in these ecological calendars, the calendar of the human body in Central Asia, that was the conception that they are within the system. So they would associate physical elements such as churning in the stomach when the sun is in the intestines, and they would link it to the spring and the activities just before spring, because that's what happens. Infections are high and there's not enough food. Right? So there was a physicality. There was a biology to this calendar, this embodiment of knowledge. And that's not hard to imagine if we think about us in that way.
You mentioned at the beginning how you get sometimes discouraged because you study climate change. Are the communities that you work with discouraged because of climate change?
They're stressed. We were in Lake Oneida last, and there's dramatic change, right? As they're interacting with us. And they truly understand that we're in this together. But there's a level of stress that's worrying, which then forces us. I'm glad you asked this question. I will probably be criticized after by the experts, but that raises the issue of what is the role of the sacred in helping reduce that stress. And this paper that's going to come out is not co-authored because I didn't want any of my colleagues to get into trouble for the ideas that I was going to suggest in that paper. But do you remember that area that I said they stopped measuring time? And remember, I said they were of different ethnicities in Central Asia, different linguistic groups, different religious interpretations. But they had the same word for those two spots. They called it a chilla, which in Persian means 40. 40 days. Actually, they could have been 20 days, they could have been 90 days, it didn't matter. But that's when they suspended time. Do you know what they call that period? They call that period the period of search, the desert. Now, I want you to think about 40 in a different way. The 40 days and nights of temptation of Christ. Where did it take place? At a high location in a desert area. Or the 40 days of rain of Noah. Or the 40 days that Muhammad spent before he got his revelation. Or the 40 days, the age of 40 when Buddha became Buddha. Right? And so on and so forth. And this idea of time when you sit and reflect. What is interesting about these ecological calendars that are over 1,000 years old is they actually built that in. They built in the moments to deal with stress, which raises the question of what is the role of the sacred when dealing with stress, especially related to climatic change. And remember, if they've had these calendars for 1,000 years, they would have dealt with stress and climate change.
Hi, you mentioned that you worked with communities in China and Afghanistan. I was just wondering, how do you even begin to reach out to these communities?
So I have actually no connection to Afghanistan, personal connection, until 2006. And I'll explain to you how I got there. At that time, I was a professor at a Canadian university. I'm a Canadian citizen. And I was given my money, and there was a press release sent out from my university that this prof got this money to go and do work on biocultural diversity in Central Asia. 20 minutes later, another press release went out. The provost of the university, his daughter, Captain Nicola Goddard, was killed in Kandahar, the only female soldier to be lost in battle in the history of the Canadian Army. And the Canadian Army is not a draft army, it's a volunteer army. So you have all kinds of income groups in it. And I had members, kids, undergraduates in my class. So first, that's when I decided that I will go to Afghanistan. Afghanistan was not in my plans. If we're gonna send our kids, we better show up too. And basically that's what I did. I got on a horse, crossed the border, and went to those communities, or walked to them, or took a tire tube and used a tire tube to cross across the river, and told the soldiers to let me in. And then I would go and walk to communities. And the soldiers and the KGB sort of said, okay, he's harmless, let's let him through. That's how I did it. In China, we reached out to colleagues and to the government, and they made deals with us that they said they will allow us to be there. That has changed now. You know what's happening in Xinjiang. But they have allowed our Han Chinese students in our communities to work together. That's how I reached out. We just went over and said, please let us in.
Okay, I apologize for those who still have questions, but we should end it there. And the word for the day is time, T-I-M-E.
So if there are, I'm sorry I went a little long. If you have questions, I'll wait here and answer them.